right, welcome back to Interventions and Detentions, folks. Thanks for tuning in again this week. It's the podcast where we talk about what's really happening in schools and education. Not just the polished version, not just what shows up in our newsletters, but the real stuff that impacts kids, teachers, and school leaders every single day. We are at episode 2:30, folks. That's season 2, episode 30. 30 episodes in, and we still have a few weeks of school left. We actually have 29 days of school left where I'm at, so the countdown is ticking, and it's going to go by super fast like it always does. Like I said, episode 230, which, immediately made me think of the most important educational question in our time. What time do you go to the dentist? Well, of course, it's tooth hurty. I had to throw that one in there, guys. It's been a long day. Episode 230, season 2, episode 30, coming at you. And honestly, that joke probably gets the same reaction as report cards do sometimes. You know it's coming. You're not too excited about it, but here we are anyway. Yes, today, folks, we're talking about something that every single person listening has experienced. Report cards. Now, I want you to think about this for just a second. You might not remember what you had for lunch last Tuesday. I know I struggle with that sometimes. You might not remember exactly what you taught third period 2 weeks ago. But I would bet you can remember exactly how it felt to get a report card as a kid. Maybe you were excited. Maybe you were nervous. Maybe you were doing mental math before you even opened it. Like, I just need this much to pass that class. Or maybe if I got an A here and a B here, am I good? That was probably BT. That was me. And now, hit that fast forward button for just a minute. Now you're a teacher or a principal or even a parent, and you're on the other side of that same system. You're the one writing the grades. You're the one explaining the grades. You're the one defending the grades. And sometimes, maybe even questioning the grades. So today, we're going to unpack all of it. We're going to talk about where report cards actually came from, how they evolved over time, what their purpose really is today, and where they might be heading in the future. Because here's the reality. Report cards are one of the most accepted parts of education. And also one of the most questioned. We all use them, but if we're being honest, a lot of us aren't completely sure they're doing what we think they're designed to do. So let's start at the beginning. Here's something that might surprise you right out of the gate. Report cards were not originally created to measure academic learning. Let me say that again. That is not why they exist. If you go back to the early 1800s, we're talking 1830s, 1840s, early American schooling. Obviously, classrooms looked very different. You had large groups of students, one teacher, usually a single classroom, very little standardization, but a wide range of ages and abilities. And honestly, it was chaotic. Teachers were trying to manage classrooms without consistent curriculum, without clear expectations or strong systems of accountability. So what did they do? They started experimenting. And one of those experiments was what we know as the report card. But at that time, it wasn't about the academic precision. It was about communication and really more about control. Teachers needed a way to tell parents what was happening in the classroom with their child. They needed a way to get support from families and to influence student behavior at the end of the day. So those early report cards focused heavily on things like student conduct, their effort, their obedience, and their punctuality. Not reading levels, not math standards, and definitely not test scores. They were mostly focused on behavior. Imagine bringing home that report card today. Hey, your child talks too much, but great attitude. You might even see that comment on there once in a while. But let's get back to it. In some cases, these early report cards were actually written as narrative letters, not grades, no numbers, just stories. And here's the part that really flips things. In some early systems, report cards weren't even about students. They were more about the teachers. They were used to evaluate how well teachers were doing their job. So originally, this whole idea of reporting was really about accountability, just not in the way we think about it now today. So right away, we should see something important. Report cards were never purely academic. They were always about communication, influence, and sometimes accountability. And honestly, that hasn't changed as much as we might think. So once report cards were introduced, they didn't stay the same. They began to evolve, just like education did. And that evolution tells us a lot about how education itself has changed. Let's walk through it. Early report cards were descriptive, personalized, but subjective. Two teachers could look at the same student and tell completely different stories. And while that sounds messy, there was also something pretty valuable there. They were describing the student. They weren't labeling them. And then came letter grades, the standardization. A, B, C, D, F. Why did we skip E? Never really figured that out. But that scale was clean, it was simple, and it was comparable. Now schools could rank students, they could compare their performance against one another, and they could make decisions about advancement of the student. But here's where the trade-off is. You gain consistency, but you lost the nuance. A student gets a B in reading. What does that actually mean? Seriously, what does it tell us? Think about that for a moment. And then we begin to look at high stakes. The grades started to matter a lot. The grades impacted things like college admissions, student scholarships, even job opportunities. So now, that report card isn't just about feedback, it becomes a gatekeeper. And then when something becomes a gatekeeper, a little bit of pressure begins to evolve. Let's fast forward now to today. Usually we're jumping in the time machine to go back in time, but let's fast forward to today, the digital era. Now we have online gradebooks and grading, parent portals where you can check student grades at a click, real-time updates. Parents don't wait for report cards anymore. They already know. Sometimes they're getting updates sent directly to their email or text. So now we have to ask, if parents already know all the things about grading and report cards, what is the report card even for anymore? So let's ground this in one question. What are report cards supposed to do at this point? In theory, they're meant to communicate learning, provide feedback, inform the families, and guide instruction. And that all sounds great. It really does. But in practice, that all gets really complicated. A student gets a B in reading. We'll go back to that example. What does that actually tell us? Are they improving? Are they struggling? Are they coasting? We don't know. When we send that report card with that B in reading to the next school that the student moves to, what does it tell them? It really compresses a complex story into a single symbol. There was a moment, and I'll never forget this. I was sitting in a parent conference going over a report card, and the parent looked at me and said, "So, my child has a C in reading. What does that mean?" And I'll be honest, I had to stop and think for a moment because I can explain the system. Well, it's not a B, it's not an A, and it's not a D or an F, it's a C. But explaining the student, that was really a little bit harder, a little more difficult. Were they improving? Yeah, I think so. Were they below grade level? Yes. Were they working hard? Absolutely. And none of that was fully captured in that single letter grade symbol. And that moment has really stuck with me over the years because it made me realize we're not just giving grades, we're trying to tell a story about the student. And sometimes we don't tell it very well. By the time a report card comes out, the learning period is obviously over. You're not influencing learning anymore. You're reporting on it after the fact. So, for example, I've had parents sit across from me completely surprised by a report card. And that's always a tough conversation because in my mind, I'm thinking, how are we just now finding this out? If a report card is the first time a parent hears that their child is struggling, we've missed something. We've missed an opportunity for communication to happen. We can't ignore this part either. Report cards carry emotion. Students start to think, I'm an A student, or I'm a C student. And that sticks. And on the flip side, I've seen students who get straight A's and they're not really learning. They've just figured out how to do school. They turn everything in, they follow directions, but push them outside of that, and they struggle. So even our highest grades don't always tell the full story. So where are we heading with report cards? Because things are changing and they're continuing to evolve even today. We're never going to get there, I don't think. We're never going to hit that plateau. We might plateau for a little while and then we decide, hey, it's time to change something. We're shifting towards what does the student actually know? What can they do? How can they perform? Not what's their average. We're seeing a lot more emphasis on, behavior, but also collaboration. We're bringing in the social, emotional skills because success isn't just academics anymore. We want that whole child picture. We also want real-time feedback because feedback is becoming more continuous all the time. And it needs to be, not only for the student, but for the parents as well, and for the teachers. Not something that happens just at the end of 9 weeks or every 9 weeks. And here is what's really interesting to me. We're starting to move back toward more of that narrative feel. Way back in those 1800s. We're seeing more written comments, more descriptions and descriptors, a little more context to what that letter grade symbol really means. In a lot of ways, we're going way back to where this all started and began. So if we step back and look at all of this, report cards have always been more than just grades. Okay? They've been about communication, accountability, motivation, perception, and now they're at a crossroad. We're at a crossroad. Where are they going next? Which turn are they going to take? Are they going to the left, the right, straight, full stream ahead? I don't know. We'll find out. So I'm going to leave you with this. And this has been a brief episode this week as we jump back in from spring break. You know, it took a week off last week. Didn't want to go too deep this week, and we just scratched the surface with report cards. But I'm going to leave you with this. What should a report card actually communicate? Should grades reflect learning? Should they reflect behavior? Maybe both. And if you could design a report card from scratch, like alakazam, here it is, what would it look like? I'd be curious to know what you're thinking out there. I feel like schools that I've been involved with always are tweaking report cards from year to year, sometimes from quarter to quarter. You know, teachers just aren't happy with what's on it or what isn't on it, and it needs to include this, but it needs to take this off. What would your perfect world report card for a child look like? What would you want to know? And I think it's different if we're asking that question to the parents, to the teachers, to the student. What would you want it to look like? What would you want to glean? Love that word. What would you want to glean from a report card nowadays? What would it look like? Tell me in the comments. Leave me some feedback. Let's talk about report cards, and maybe this is going to springboard into a longer conversation down the road about grading and reporting. We had Dave Nagel on, who is the author of Grading Visible Learners. So we've talked about grading, but we didn't really talk a lot about report cards. So think about that. Let's get some feedback on what you want to know about grading and reporting. I appreciate you tuning in every week. Thanks for listening to Interventions and Detentions. If this episode got you thinking, share it with someone in education. Share it with some parents. Share it with some fellow teachers and principals. Don't forget to check out all the Intervention and Detention social media outlets and catch up on all of Season 1 and Season 2. Remember, we're on number 30, folks. It's climbing quick, but we're coming to the end of the school year fast as well, and we will take some time off this summer. But we'll be back for another Season 3 here before you know it. New episodes drop every Friday morning right around that 8 o'clock hour. Tune in to Interventions and Detentions, folks. Remember, it's where the real learning begins. I'll catch you next time.